sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When death has come and taken our loved ones, it leaves our home so lonely and drear. Then do we wonder why others prosper, living so wicked year after year. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When we see Jesus coming in glory, when he comes from his home in the sky, then we shall meet him in that bright mansion. We'll understand it all by and by. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long, while there are others living about us, never molested, going the wrong. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When death has come and taken our loved ones, it leaves our home so lonely and drear. Then do we wonder why others prosper, living so wicked year after year. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When we see Jesus coming in glory, when he comes from his home in the sky, then we shall meet him in that bright mansion. sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When death has come and taken our loved ones, it leaves our home so lonely and drear. Then do we wonder why others prosper, living so wicked year after year. Father alone will know all about it. Father alone will understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. When we see Jesus coming in glory, when he comes from his home in the sky, then we shall meet him in that bright mansion. We'll understand it all by and by. Father alone will know all about it.
All right. Well, we kind of left off in this section here. We weren't able to finish it. 1 Timothy 5 is where we left off, talking about the exciting topic of widows, right? The care of widows. We know how riveting that is, and we know how you've been anticipating that, I'm sure, as we talked about last week. But we reminded ourselves that almost 16 verses are devoted to this topic. I mean, there are some topics and there are some other subject matters that we give a lot of focus to that don't have half the verses. And so it's just something to be mindful of. Of course, we understand the context of first century. They did not have government system of Social Security and Medicare and other things that help assist our elderly people. I mean, you just think about that. Where would so many of our elderly be if we didn't have those and that kind of a system in place and everything? And so other countries and other cultures down through the centuries have not had that, and that was certainly in the case of the first century. And so if you lost your husband, you lost your way to be supported, you lost your rights to your, if that wasn't secured with your land, I mean, everything was tied up in the husband, and if you didn't have sons or children, you were in trouble. And so the church is going to be a stopgap. It's going to fill in that and be a support to those. And remember, he talked about in verses 1 and 2, he said how we treat everyone in the church. The older men as fathers, and younger men as brothers, and older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, in all things in purity. And then recognize those who are widows who are really in need. And he's going to define that as he talks about that they are to be supported financially, that the church has this responsibility. And we talked about in the Bible there are 3 categories that you really don't want to mess with and get on God's bad side with. Widows, orphans, or the stranger, the foreigner. Those are 3 categories in the Old Testament that God says, you be careful how you treat them. And they reflect me. And so, well, these widows, we talked about first he falls back on if she has children and grandchildren. We talked about that in verses 4 and 5. That is the opportunity for them to exercise their faith, their piety, their religion. And that is the responsibility that they have to care for, to repay their parents and grandparents. This is pleasing to God. You know, I thought it'd be I don't know if I've ever done it, but take all the statements that are this is pleasing to God. That would be a great series, a great class, a great sermon series. I've always thought that. And that might surprise us if we looked at that list and looked at that and said, I wonder if I'm focusing on the things that are what? Pleasing to God. It's something interesting to think about. This is on there, isn't it? The care for widows. And he says, when a family does this, this is pleasing to God. And then he talks about in verses 5, the widow who's really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. And so, he's going to talk here about the widow who's devoted themselves to God here and is to be honored and cared for, and not those that have just lived selfishly for themselves. And verse 8, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So some of the strongest language you find here, a warning about Christians, about caring for your family, the responsibility that we should, if anyone doesn't provide for their relatives, especially those in their own household, they have denied the faith. What do you think about when you think about denied the faith? What that comes to mind there? That strong language. You're not listening to God? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Jeff. Yeah. 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 And that confessing is more than just saying, Lord, Lord. Jesus said, why do you call me Lord, Lord? Finish it for me. And not do the things that I say. And so it kind of ties what Angie says. To listen to God. To not listen to God and obey God is to deny Him. And same with Christ, as Jeff is saying. And so you have, of course, the thing about it is, they may not see it that they are actually doing what? Denying God. Now we know that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had developed some loopholes. Have you ever noticed how we're pretty good with that? Finding exceptions to rules? What? It must be politicians. Yeah, we can get on them, but let's not get on them too much because we are great at finding exceptions. I'd love to. I really want to. I was hoping I could, but this, that, and the other. And yeah, Kathy?
Well, James says that those who know to do good and don't do it, it's sin.
Yeah.
So that kind of wipes out all the loopholes you think.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you know to do right and you don't do it, then you
Right. But we become masters at loopholes. I'm telling you, the Pharisees in the first century context, with that whole thing with, when Jesus says, why do you disregard the commandments of God? And they're like, what commandments? How about honor your father and mother? You have said, I would love to help you out, Mom, Dad, but I've devoted this money to Corban, to God. And it wasn't like they were given that actual money. It was like money that they had possession of and were going to somewhere in the future maybe give to God. So they were still using it, but they were saying, I can't give it to you, Mom, Dad, to help you because I may give this to God. And Jesus says, you found these loopholes that I'd like to help you, but I've already, and we become masters at that kind of stuff. And Jesus here, the Bible, just as was mentioned, just gets it down to so clear. We mentioned this last week, I think. In the Old Testament, honor your father and mother means two things. It's real simple. When you're young and under their authority, it means you obey them. You submit to them. As is in the Lord, always what? Qualifies that. That which is pleasing to God, you only submit and obey those, not just parents, but anyone that you're under. So you honor and obey when you're young, when you're under their authority. You do what they say. But the second aspect is you honor and obey, you honor your parents is you take care of them and they're in their older age. And those are the two ways that you obey the fifth command. And they had found ways around that, of course, and it continues to happen this day. Doing funerals, it can be, you see that. You see loved ones over the years that I've done funerals for, elderly members, and when the loved one dies, the family sometimes comes out of the woodwork, and sometimes I'm wondering, where were you at when she was in need a lot of times? I don't ever remember seeing you around much or hearing. I heard her talk about you a lot, how you wished to come, you were hoping to come. My son's going to come. He's so busy. He's so busy. He's so busy. He's going to come one day. And then they never come, right? And then the funeral comes, and the son or grandson or granddaughter wants to just cry, cry, cry. Well, sometimes I've worked in a little bit of paddling in the sermon. You can do that and say, "Boy, your mother sure loved you, wanted to see you." I mean, it's hard to not kind of do that. And you've seen that before. Of course, as the old thing goes, when people die, they're there to read the will, right? They're quickly there to read the will and find out how much they were loved by their mother, father, grandmother, grandfather. And so we're pretty good at this, and the Bible here gets right to it and says you've got to take care of them. You've got to look after them. And so if you're able to, you have to be able to do that. And so he says you've denied the faith, you're worse than an unbeliever. Then in verse 9, no widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60 and has been faithful to her husband. So here we get into these qualifications that he's going to have. Oh, by the way, I thought one commentator said was real interesting. I don't know if I wrote it down or not. No, I don't think I did the quote. But it basically said, your parents are your parents, what was the quote? Are your first set of neighbors. Honor your father and mother. Love your neighbor as yourself. Your parents are your first set of neighbors. I thought that was good in the commentary. I hadn't really ever thought about that. And we hurt and damage our faith, the credibility of our faith, when we don't take care of our parents and look after them. These qualifications, don't ask me to, why 60? Is that the age, especially back then, that you were like, you're not able to provide, or physically, or I don't know. Maybe, yeah, maybe the more, he's going to get into that. The younger ones, obviously, I think, Jeff, that absolutely is what, I don't know if, I think we have to, 59 and a half. Oh, sorry, you got to starve for 6 months. We got to be careful with that kind of stuff, the way we read Scripture. When we read Scripture like a rule book, like a judicial law, we can become very legalistic. I don't think that's the idea, but I think this is an idea here. This is a good age to kind of consider that when women are who are widows or otherwise are not able to continue to provide a living for themselves. And then he gives the qualifications as we see the relatives. And so some of the things that he gives, what are some of the things he mentions here? Verses 10 and verse 10 there. Okay. Has been, don't forget the first one, been faithful to her husband, right? Is well known for her good deeds, has brought up children, lodged strangers, or showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those who are in trouble, and devoting ourselves to all kinds of good deeds. I mean, it reads like the qualifications for elders and deacons, huh? Like, it's real interesting how that is. Now, we talked about qualifications for elders and deacons other than the family and children qualification. Those are all attributes all Christians should be striving for, not just elders and deacons. Now, they have to have that maturity level if they're going to serve, but those are for all Christians to be growing and achieving that. Yeah, Angie? Right. Well, that's a good question, Angie. I think that I think in every case that would have to be looked at uniquely. I think the spirit and the principle of the teaching would, uh, uh, if they've met these other qualifications. Again, the question is always the devil's in the details. What was the nature of that divorce? What happened in that divorce? Was she abandoned? Was she neglected and abused herself by her husband and had no recourse but to get out of that situation? I mean, there would be some details that would need to be looked at, but obviously, I think, still the qualifications of someone who's been faithful to their spouse, who's meeting these qualifications, I don't see why not in theory, in principle, why that wouldn't be the case. But excellent question. So he mentions all these here. And this is what you see a godly woman. You see a primary, her role as a wife. You see her role as a mother. You see her role as a support with her compassion and hospitality and service. This is a very core to what a Christian woman should be like. This isn't the only thing a godly Christian woman should be. There's other qualifications, other descriptions, but this is at the heart of it. Yeah, back here, Jeff.
I want to back you up just a minute.
Yeah, back up.
This is before you put them on the list. Why don't you talk about that list? What do you think that list means? Or I can tell you what I think it means.
Okay.
Tell me I'm wrong.
Okay, go ahead.
But he's not saying that women that other people who don't fit this criteria shouldn't be helped. He's saying these are the ones that should be put on this list.
Right.
And I've always assumed this list is like the list that they had in Acts when they distributed food. These
Right.
were widows who the church took care of
Right.
on a constant basis.
Right. Yep.
So,
Yeah, you're right. It's not they weren't helping others.
young widows may need help.
That's right.
We may need to help young widows.
Right.
It's not saying anything about not helping those
Right.
in need. It's just talking about putting widows on the
This is a long-term, long care plan that these women are going to receive from the church versus some temporary, some momentary, one-time, occasional help that, other people are going to be helped in the church. Let us do good unto all, especially the household of faith, right? Galatians 6 tells us. But this long-term care is what he's driving at. Is younger widows, as he's going to talk about, they're going to have some other recourses. Now, whether we like to say it or not, and it's happening today, it happens. We may not want to say it. I'll go ahead and say it. But people remarry for financial reasons. That's exactly what people remarry for. And it continues to happen to this day, that a primary motivation for people remarrying when they get certainly 50 and older is financial. You just try living on your own, right? And some of you guys are shaking your heads and they're going, "I'm doing it, Robert. It's tough." And so there are these younger women naturally, obviously, are going to have more opportunities to, as they're younger, to remarry and to be supported, where the elderly ones are not. We know women typically outlive men anyway, so if these women are older, their choices are. So, I agree, Jeff, absolutely. This idea of this, they're not going to be helping. It's not that they're not helping others, but this is this long-term care. Yeah, real good. Appreciate that. And so he gets on here, these are the marks of a godly Christian woman. These are things that are not the only characteristics of a godly Christian woman, but they should certainly be at the very core of a godly Christian woman who is a wife, who is a mother. Remember what Peter would say in 1 Peter 3, that let your beauty be the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is great in the sight of God. And so there's another mark of that the Bible will give. And so here she has. But what is that also saying about her? These specifics. What does this say? Verse 10. What is this describing about her heart, her character? What has she been devoted to? Devoted to God, but specifically there at the tail end, what are these things it mentions? Good works. She's poured into other people, right? She's helped other people. Now it's her turn. Now we don't do so we can get, right? You ever been around someone who does that? They hand out gifts and they do things but where's mine, right? They want something out of it. We're not talking about that. Here's someone who does it because it pleases the Lord, and now it's time to honor those and to take care of those who have helped others. They are now to be helped. And again, like Jeff said, it's not that the church is not going to help others. Even we're going to sometimes help others who aren't so worthy. What I mean by that is there's going to be times in the church where we've helped people who, they're not making good choices. They're not living right always. They're struggling, and it doesn't mean we're not going to help people like that sometimes. However, we're not putting them on the payroll, is what that means. And every church I've been at with elders and deacons over benevolence, we've had those discussions. We're not helping them anymore. For a while, they're not making good choices. They're not living faithfully. They're not making no effort to live godly life. We're going to have to make, because as we mentioned last week, the church is not unlimited resources, right? And that's why he said, first let the family take care of them, and so it doesn't be a burden on the church. Yeah, Roy? They do. They do. And I'm okay with that to an extent. I'm okay with, because number one, you're never going to know when you do something good to someone who has bad motives, that can sometimes transform them. You've seen that. But I do think there is a limit, and there has to be a point where we say, we're not doing any more. But with these widows, they have devoted themselves to good works. They are worthy to be honored and put on this support, this list. And so again, verse 11, as for younger widows, do not put them on the list. And I like what Jeff was saying. It doesn't mean we're not going to help them. But this is not to be an ongoing support. For when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. And Paul talks about this idea that, he has a right to have a wife. Now, the assumption we believe is that Paul was married at one point. If he was on the Sanhedrin, which is the all indication that he was. So there's a good likelihood that when Paul says, I've lost all things for the sake of Christ, he lost his family. Remember, by the way, side note, I'm chasing a rabbit. Remember in the book of Acts, one of the plots to kill Paul is foiled by his sister's son, his nephew. Where's sister at? I don't know. Probably not. Sister, brothers, wife has probably been, he's lost them. But here's the nephew we always give a hard time. Oh, I got a worthless nephew. I've got that nephew, he steps up and helps. Where's sister? Where's brother? Where's Paul's family? I'll tell you where they're at. They've cut him off, is where they're at. And he has lost all things for Christ's sake. You just let that sit a little bit, what Paul gave up to be a Christian when he turned, in their eyes, turned their back on God and started following this Jesus, the Messiah. So Paul says you can devote yourselves more in service to Christ, obviously, when you don't have a family, when you don't have a wife and kids. And so these women that are doing that, these older women these widow women are not going to, likely, again, they're not going to remarry, is the indication likelihood. And so these younger widows, they're not to be put on that list. They're younger, they're going to have desire to marry, and they're not going to be able to keep devoting themselves. What's also interesting, I think, about this is these widows are going to continue to do this. The church is going to get a bunch of, I don't know what they'd call it on the door in the office, but I am the minister, the widow who works in the widow ministry, or think about what these women are going to continue to do. Remember when Dorcas, she's making all the clothes, and I'm just saying, she wasn't put on a list like this, but I'm just saying, imagine what these women are going to continue to be able to do for the church as they're supported financially in serving. And so, again, these younger women are not going to be able to do that. because they're going to be focused on, their sexual desires and to remarry. And so there's some reasons why he says that here. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they've broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but they also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to talk. And so I counsel the younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Satan. And so the temptation would be, you get into all these personal matters when you're dealing with the benevolence in the church, and these younger women and these younger widows, if they're not careful, they can get swept up into, what we talk about when we talked about deacons. Remember, go back several weeks ago. One of the qualifications for deacons is they've got to be, what was the language there that, let me see here. They got to be worthy of respect. They've got to be people, men, who can keep things confidential. They've got to be men who are honorable in the sense, and what it's talking about is they don't blab. They're going from house to house. These deacons are working with widows, other people, and we talked about when you walk into someone's house, you see a whole new world of their life privately. And these deacons have got to be honorable men. Well, these younger women, they're the same thing. If they get put on this and they get caught up in everybody's business and the temptation there to talk about that and to spread that, it's not that men can't do that and this, that, and the other, but this would be a temptation as well. Another reason why he talks about these younger women, widows, are not to do that, to be put on this list. The temptation is here to get caught up in all this gossip and all this inside information you're finding out when you deal with people's personal lives and family, and so he says, I counsel widows, younger widows, to marry, to have children, to manage the home. And that's general counsel. This isn't absolute 100% all young widows have to do this. I've seen some widows, younger widows, who said, look, one time was enough for me. And they don't desire to be remarried. And so this is just general counsel, of course, that is to be read that way, that these are the roles that they would need to focus on in their life if they're going to serve God, is to do that. And then he finishes it off, verse 15. Some have, in fact, already turned away from Satan. He's going to mention twice in this section about giving the devil an opportunity. I find that interesting. The devil looks for any opening he can get, and he'll do that here with these situations with these women who've lost their husbands, and it can be what might seem like a good thing to support them financially. These young women, young widows, Paul says, could actually open up Satan and to give an opportunity. And so he mentions that here in this regard. Then in verse 16, as he continues, we've got the I would have, so we covered that. Mentioned the husband of one wife, or the good works, raise their children, wash the feet of the disciples. And then verse 16, if any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them. She should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. And again, that comes back to the whole idea here, is that the church resources are not unlimited, and so they need to be directed towards those who can be financially helped and assisted. And so, again, there's a lot of cultural context and significance that is lost on our culture 2,000 years later. There's a lot of questions that you would have, that I would have as well. When should the church do this? Why doesn't the church do this more? The church has done stuff like this. Probably you just don't realize it, with helping members, helping some of our senior members with widows. And so, but it's a very unique first century situation that really Paul needed to address it in how we honor our family, our loved ones when they're in need. Any questions, comments on that section? Kind of thoughts? Yeah, Jeff. Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. And that's again, and it's always a tough call to make in some situations with people, just in general with benevolence. But yes, those who are godly Christians, and certainly godly Christian widows and women, and widowers, it'd be the same thing. If I think again, don't read the scriptures like a law book, because the same principle would apply if you've got a gentleman who has no family, who has no resources, who cannot provide for himself. The church has an obligation to help him just as much as they do the woman. Okay, so don't make that more than. But this was culturally the context, and so he doesn't have to address that per se, because the men had much more financial security, legal protection than the women did. And so there's a lot of uniqueness in the first century here but the principle and the spirit of it would apply to that. All right. Well, I got widows. Let's quickly here get these elders straightened out, because now he's going to get into the elders. About time. Okay. And by the way, our elders are in here. They have not been in here the last few months. They've been teaching the high school class, so they are now in here, so we can let them have it. All right. Someone read verses 17 through 20. Who's got that? 17 through 20 of 1 Timothy 5. Okay, Kathy?
Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest may fear."
Okay, remember we've talked about Timothy has been sent here. He's in his mid-late 30s. He might be in his early 40s. There's somewhere in that range. And one of the things he's going to do, we've talked about from chapter 1, is he has to confront false teaching. And that false teaching is coming from within the leadership primarily. Go back to Acts 20 we talked about. Paul says among the Ephesian elders, wolves are going to rise up, not sparing the flock. And so a lot of these problems have come through bad elders, false teachers who have risen up in the leadership and even outside now have kind of have led people astray. And so Timothy's got to confront, he's got to rebuke, and he's been talking to Timothy about how to do that, how not to do that. Well, he finally kind of gets into some specifics here about when you do that. And so Timothy has a tough job here, and so that's what he's going to. Let me just set the stage here. These elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honor, and so we talked about the words that are used to describe the elders. They're shepherds, they're overseers. And so we've talked about there's that idea of overseeing or managing. There's the idea of shepherding. There's the idea of an elder is an older and distributes. In the Old Testament, remember we said the word elder would often deal with disputes. And so elders would deal with disputes that would happen in the law of Moses with the people. And so elders will often have to deal with disputes among members and issues. And so, but this idea has the idea of that managing. They have ruled, they have directed the affairs of the church. These elders who have done that and have done that well, especially those, look here, who are worthy of double honor, especially those who work specifically, what's he mentioned? Teaching and preaching. And so that's going to be real important that we talk about that. he's going to get into the principle of supporting those who are preaching the gospel full time and devoting themselves to that. And there were elders who were doing that. There weren't just what we would call ministers or evangelists. There were elders who were teaching elders, who were preaching elders. And this is interesting because it also it notes that not all elders are going to be involved in that aspect of the shepherding work of preaching and teaching. There are elders who are not going to be teachers and preachers per se. Now, we all know elders have to be able to teach. They have to be able to defend and to teach the gospel. This is not talking about that. This is talking about there are men who are gifted. There are men who are called by God in ways, whether we think about preachers or ministers, and certainly elders who would be that way. And so these men need to be supported. And he's going to quote, of course, we'll have to pick up there. He's going to quote there in verse 18, "For the scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while spreading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages." Paul will say the same thing for preachers, by the way. I had an instructor in Harding named Jimmy Allen. And he would always tease us. He said, "Now you've got to preach that part of the Bible when it says pay the preacher." He would always give us a hard time about that. And so Paul will also use that same statement that those who devote their lives to the gospel should make their living from the gospel. And so the scriptural authority or pattern to pay those or support those financially who are preaching the gospel full time. Same with these elders. Some elders who've devoted themselves completely to the work, the church can support them. The church can care for them. The church can, so to speak, financially help them so that they can devote themselves to what? Same thing with the minister. So he can devote himself to what? Full time doing that. And so now we know Paul was a tent maker, and there were times that he says, "I didn't take the support of the church." 1 Corinthians, he says, it wasn't going to be a good thing. They were going to accuse me of doing it for the money. And so in certain context, it wouldn't always be the best thing. But here these elders, they first says, are worthy of double honor, not only for the shepherding that they do, but some of them are devoting themselves to the preaching and teaching of the word. And they're worthy of the support of church. I don't think I've ever seen that. I don't think I've ever seen a full-time elder who's in the preaching and teaching supported by the church, but it certainly would be biblical if that's what... yeah, absolutely. They have their talents, and that talent may be in the preaching and teaching of the gospel. And so that was unique, certainly more so in the first century church than what we might currently see today. We'll have to kind of pick off there. I know we kind of stopped in the middle of something there, but I don't want to get into, I want to come back a little bit to that, about that honor. And then we get into the accusation. What do you do with elders who are sinning and consistently doing wrong? And so we'll look at what Paul says. All right.